So in this video, we will begin our look at the argument-based passage and some general details before we get into the actual strategies. So there are going to be 3 argument-based passages per test, 1 question per passage in each case. From a distance of a few feet away, these passages will resemble normal short passages, the kind we've been looking at to this point, but they're going to differ in terms of their focus. So the questions, quite appropriately, will deal with argumentation or reasoning as opposed to the content of the question. So the different question types we looked at in the last half dozen videos won't apply to these argument-based passages. Another difference is that these argument-based passages will only contain regular multiple choice questions. So no select all that apply questions. And then as a side note, we can just keep in mind that even though there are only 3 of these questions per test, so not a huge percentage of the verbal questions by any means, preparing for these questions will help with the argument essay and vice versa. Some terminology, so I just mentioned a couple of these terms, but we can say a little bit more about them. So a premise. So a premise is anything in a passage that provides support for the conclusion. So that can be a fact or an opinion. In other words, a statement of fact or a statement of opinion on the part of the author. A counter premise, on the other hand, is any evidence, again, fact or opinion, that challenges or contradicts the conclusion. Now, not every passage will contain a counter premise. On the other hand, a passage can contain more than one counter premise. It's kind of rare, given that these passages are only one paragraph, and a premise or a counter premise is generally going to take up a whole sentence. But there have been passages in which you have multiple premises, multiple counter premises, again, passages in which you don't have any counter premises, etc. So we'll see some different mixes as we go forward into these specific examples. Another term, you're no doubt familiar with the term assumption from everyday life, but in the context of argument-based passages, an assumption is any unstated information that is taken for granted but nonetheless must hold true in order for the conclusion to be valid. So by nature, by definition, an assumption is not going to be stated in the passage. It's not going to be on the page. It's going to be in between the lines, so to speak. You might say, well, what's the big deal if it's not on the page? Well, a lot of times when it comes to strengthening an argument or weakening an argument, the assumptions that the passage takes for granted will play an important role. And then the conclusion is the main point of the argument. It is what the argument is arguing for. Usually comes at the end of the passage, but it doesn't have to. Now, of these 4 components, the one you want to identify first is the conclusion. The reason for that is you won't actually be able to tell what counts as a premise as opposed to a counter premise until you know what the conclusion is. So if you identify the conclusion, then you can work backward and identify the points that support it, the points that go against it, and then brainstorm an assumption or 2. In other words, try to spot a hole in the argument, something that it takes for granted, something that could either be challenged in order to weaken the argument or something that could be verified in order to strengthen the argument. Now, the only kind of question in which you don't need to worry about assumptions will be the questions that involve identifying sentence roles. So we'll have a video on that in particular. But for all the other question types, whether you're directly asked to identify an assumption or whether you're asked to strengthen an argument or weaken an argument, identifying assumptions is definitely important. Now, a couple of other terms before we get into a specific example. Limiting words and phrases. So limiting words are, as the term suggests, words that narrow or limit the scope of a claim. So what does that mean? It means that they add nuance to an argument and make it harder to challenge. So some examples of limiting words: except, unless, mainly or mostly, as opposed to entirely, relatively, provided that. So all of these words signal that some qualification is about to be added, some qualification or point of clarification that makes the statement a little bit harder to challenge. So students should return to school next Monday, provided that they don't have any symptoms that would suggest a serious illness. It's not saying that all students should return to school next Monday, but all of them who do not show symptoms. So again, we'll talk more about how these function in the context of actual questions as we go forward, but for now we can contrast limiting words and phrases with extreme words and phrases. So extreme words, in contrast to limiting words, tend to make an argument more vulnerable to challenge or easier to challenge. So again, continuing with that contrast, If limiting words add nuance and soften an argument, by adding qualifications and exceptions, extreme words tend to harden an argument, to make it more brittle, again, to make it more vulnerable to challenge. So examples of some extreme words include never, always, none, nothing, all, completely, only, entirely. And so we can see how this can make an argument more vulnerable to challenge in this little sentence. Television offers nothing of substance in the way of educational programming. So the extreme word here is nothing. And so if you wanted to challenge this, all you would need to do is to be able to show that, well, it offers a little tiny sliver of something of substance. Maybe there's one TV show that offers something of substance in the way of educational programming. So if we had used a limiting word or phrase, something like television offers relatively little of substance in the way of educational programming, that would be a lot harder to challenge, because first you'd have to dissect what is meant by relatively little. How do we compare it? What's the right proportion? Whereas again, when you have these extreme words, much easier to challenge. Now let's look at a sample passage and talk about how we can identify these different parts. So we'll go ahead and read it to begin with. So last year, Smith Foods launched a 12-month advertising campaign for its potato chips. Last year, Smith sold 10 million bags of potato chips compared to the 8 million sold during the previous year, an increase that can be directly attributed to new customers brought in by the ad campaign. Profits from additional sales, however, were substantially less than the cost of the advertising campaign. Clearly, therefore, the campaign did nothing to further Smith's economic interests. So there, right off the bat, we see one of those extreme words. But the first thing we want to do, remember, is we want to identify the conclusion, and that's going to come with the very last sentence. Our signal that this is the conclusion is not the fact that it is the last sentence, though. It's this word here, therefore. So when you see a word like therefore or consequently, that tells you that the conclusion is about to be stated. So clearly the campaign did nothing to further Smith's economic interests. The previous sentence represents a premise because it's leading up to the conclusion. So profits from additional sales were less than the cost of the advertising campaign. And then as we continue to work our way backward, we note the word however. So that tells us that the previous sentence is pointing in the opposite direction. In other words, it's a counter premise. So they did sell a lot of potato chips. They increased the number of bags of potato chips they sold by 2 million or by 25%. And so that's pretty good, but we can see from the way the next sentence follows it that these are not pointing in the same direction. And then again, the fact that this is the conclusion, this must be a premise. This must be a counter premise. And then the first sentence here, it's kind of just background information. It doesn't really work one way or the other to support or contradict the conclusion. Now, what about assumptions? Potential holes in the argument that could be exploited to weaken the argument or verified, patched up in order to strengthen the argument. One assumption might be that Smith's economic interests go hand in hand with potato chip sales. In other words, that the only way to benefit or further Smith's economic interests is to sell more potato chips. Why might that be an assumption that could potentially weaken the argument? Well, let's think about this next one that's pretty closely related to that, and that is that it seems to be assuming or taking for granted that customers who buy potato chips are not going to buy anything else. It could be that customers who buy Smith potato chips will also buy Smith potato chip dip or some other Smith Foods product. So potentially by selling more potato chips, bringing in more customers to buy their potato chips, they could benefit their business in other ways by attracting more customers to their brand, potentially boosting sales of related products. The third assumption here is it's not really considering anything about the potato chip industry as a whole, the snack food industry, we could say more generally, but maybe there has been a decline in sales in the potato chip industry, or maybe there's been an increase in the sales. So something like that. We don't know anything about really the background in which Smith Foods is operating. So all these are things that could potentially be relevant. Now, one other thing to note, and we kind of pointed this out at the beginning, this word nothing. So that's an extreme word. And that's important because when we get to the question, it's going to ask us which of the following most seriously weakens the argument. Well, if the argument is that the campaign did nothing for Smith's economic interests, all we would need to do in order to weaken that argument would be to show that the campaign did something for Smith's economic interests. In other words, that it benefited Smith's economic interest in some way, however small. That would weaken the argument if we could show that. So let's look at the answer choices. Sales of potato chips account for a relatively small percentage of Smith Foods products. Okay. Well, if that was true, would that really weaken the argument? Not really, because even if potato chips account for a relatively small percentage of Smith Foods' profits, they still contribute to their profits to a certain extent. And if they're going to launch a 12-month advertising campaign, it's probably not a tiny, tiny proportion. Maybe it's 20%, 30%, but that's not going to really weaken the argument. So we'll just keep on moving and look at the next answer choice. B, most of the people who bought Smith's potato chips for the first time as a result of the campaign were already loyal customers of other Smith products. Well, if anything, that would strengthen the argument, because what this would suggest is that the campaign didn't bring in a lot of new customers. As it says here, they were already loyal customers of other Smith products. So if anything, that would suggest that the advertising campaign wasn't particularly helpful. So again, given that the argument states that the campaign did nothing to further their economic interests, this would only strengthen that argument. C, a less expensive advertising campaign would have brought in significantly fewer new customers for Smith's potato chips than did the campaign that Smith Foods launched last year. Well, we can think about this one for a second. Okay, a less expensive advertising campaign would have brought in significantly fewer customers than the one that they did launch. We could also say that it would have cost them less money. It's hard to really tell how that trade-off works, but I wouldn't want to eliminate this one just yet. We can come back to it. D, Smith made money on sales of potato chips last year. Well, that wouldn't weaken the argument. And then when we get to E, in each of the past 5 years, there was a steep industry-wide decline in sales of potato chips. And we look at this and say, aha, if there has been a decline in the sales of potato chips and their competitors are having various rates of decline in their own sales, but then Smith comes along and reverses that decline, that would suggest that this advertising campaign was beneficial to the company, even if the profits from additional sales were less than the cost of the advertising campaign. We could think of all the things that selling more potato chips and reversing that decline could contribute to the company. To buck the trend and reverse the decline, that suggests that this advertising campaign did do some things that benefited the company. And if we look back at C, a less expensive advertising campaign would have brought in fewer new customers. It's kind of like it doesn't really strengthen it or weaken it. They would have spent less money, they would have brought in fewer customers. Spend more money, bring in more customers. It's kind of hard to see exactly where the break-even point is in terms of that trade-off. So we could say there it doesn't really strengthen it or weaken it, whereas E does strengthen it because, again, it shows that the company benefited from increased sales at a time when their competitors were struggling. So in the next 4 videos, we will look at specific question types, the most common question types associated with argument-based passages, and those will be questions on strengthening an argument, questions on weakening an argument, questions on identifying assumptions, and then questions on identifying sentence roles.